captured on the battlefield, Spartacus, a Thracian warrior once free under the open skies, found himself shackled and stripped of his identity. The Roman soldiers who dragged him from his homeland saw only a prize of war, a man whose strength could be sold to the highest bidder. For Spartacus, the weight of the chains was more than physical, it was the crushing realization that his life was no longer his own. When the auction hammer fell, Spartacus was purchased by a lanista, the owner of a gladiator school in Capua. The journey to his new prison was a march of humiliation. He walked among other captives, their faces etched with defeat, while Roman citizens jeered from the roadside. Some threw scraps of bread, not out of pity but for the cruel amusement of watching proud men scramble for crumbs. Spartacus didn't bow his head, he burned the faces of his captors into his memory. He would not forget. The gladiator school was a fortress of brutality, a place where men were trained not just to fight but to kill for the entertainment of Rome's bloodthirsty crowds. The moment he entered, Spartacus was greeted by the sounds of fists meeting flesh, the sharp crack of whips, and the guttural cries of men pushed beyond their limits. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, iron, and despair. Doctor, the relentless trainer, wasted no time. He scanned the new arrivals with the cold precision of a butcher appraising livestock. His eyes lingered on Spartacus, sizing up the warrior's broad shoulders and hardened frame. "You'll fight well," Doctor said, almost as if it were a threat. Spartacus said nothing, but his defiant stare spoke volumes. Training began before dawn and ended only when every ounce of strength had been wrung from their bodies. The recruits were starved, beaten, and pushed to their breaking points. The weak were discarded, their bodies dumped unceremoniously outside the walls. Survival meant becoming more than a man, it meant becoming a weapon. Spartacus stood out from the beginning. It wasn't just his physical prowess, though his strength was undeniable. It was his mind, sharp, calculating, and unwilling to be broken. When he fought in the practice arena, it wasn't wild rage that drove him but a disciplined fury. He studied his opponents, learning their weaknesses, exploiting their mistakes. Doctor noticed. So did the other gladiators. Among them were Crassus, a Gaul whose strength was matched only by his pride, and Gannicus, a Celt with a devil-may-care grin and unmatched skill with a blade. Both men were formidable, and both, like Spartacus, longed for freedom. A silent camaraderie began to form between them, born of shared suffering and an unspoken understanding that their chains could only be broken through blood. Yet, life in the ludus was a constant dance with death. The lanista, a shrewd and greedy man, saw his gladiators as investments, but even he was not above sacrificing them for a lucrative fight. Every day brought the possibility of being sent to the arena, where the roar of the crowd drowned out the dying screams of those who fought and fell. Spartacus watched as friends were taken, never to return. Each loss hardened his resolve. But it wasn't just the threat of death that stoked the fire within Spartacus. It was the injustice of it all, the way Rome treated men like beasts, stripping them of their dignity and forcing them to die for the amusement of others. He began to see the cracks in the empire's facade, the hypocrisy of a civilization that called itself great while building its glory on the backs of the oppressed. Spartacus was biding his time. He knew that strength alone wouldn't free him. He needed allies, a plan, and most of all, patience. As he trained, he spoke quietly to the other gladiators, planting seeds of rebellion in their hearts. Not all listened, many were too broken to hope. But those who did found their courage rekindled by Spartacus' words. In the dark, oppressive walls of the ludus, where hope was a dangerous thing, Spartacus began to dream of a life without chains. And with every grueling day, with every lash of the whip and every fight that left him bloodied but alive, he grew closer to becoming not just a warrior, but a leader. The Romans thought they had bought a slave. What they didn't realize was that they had forged a legend. The night the rebellion began, the air in the ludus felt different, heavier, charged with a tension that seemed to hum in the silence. Spartacus sat in the shadows, his back against the cold stone wall, watching the guards patrol the yard. Around him, the other gladiators pretended to sleep, but their breaths were shallow, their bodies taut with anticipation. The plan had been whispered in secrecy for weeks, passed from ear to ear like a forbidden prayer. Tonight, they would no longer bow their heads. Tonight, they would fight. The idea had seemed impossible at first, suicide, even. How could unarmed slaves stand against trained guards armed to the teeth? But Spartacus, with his keen mind and unshakable resolve, had seen the cracks in the system. The guards were complacent, drunk on the power they held over their captives. They didn't expect rebellion, and that was their weakness. When the signal came, it was as subtle as the shift in the wind, a muffled cough, a creak of wood. Spartacus rose without hesitation, his eyes sharp and his muscles coiled like a spring. Around him, the others followed, silent as predators in the night. Their weapons were laughable by any standard: kitchen knives, sharpened spoons, even broken table legs. But in their hands, these crude tools were more than instruments of violence. They were symbols of defiance, of a refusal to be broken. The first guard didn't even have time to scream. Spartacus moved like a shadow, his makeshift dagger slicing through the air with precision. The man crumpled, and chaos erupted. The gladiators swarmed the yard, their pent-up fury unleashed in a cacophony of shouts and the clang of metal against flesh. Blood stained the ground, but it was the guards who fell, their arrogance no match for the sheer ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. Spartacus fought at the forefront, his voice rising above the din for freedom. He roared, his words electrifying the others. Men who had been beaten into submission found their strength again, their fear replaced by a burning need for vengeance. The walls of the ludus, which had once seemed impenetrable, now felt fragile under the weight of their fury. When the final guard was struck down, the silence that followed was deafening. The gladiators stood among the wreckage, their chests heaving, their hands trembling. Victory was theirs, but Spartacus knew it was only the beginning. The real battle lay ahead. "Take what you can," he ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Weapons, food, anything that will help us survive." He looked around at the faces of his comrades, Crassus, bloodied but grinning, Gannicus, his eyes alight with exhilaration. They had done the impossible, but now they faced the wrath of Rome. Under the cover of darkness, they fled the ludus, their steps quick and silent. Spartacus led them towards the distant silhouette of Mount Vesuvius, its imposing shadow a beacon of hope and refuge. The mountain would be their sanctuary, a place to regroup and plan their next move. But as they ascended its slopes, the weight of what they had done began to sink in. Around a makeshift campfire, the gladiators sat in uneasy silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Spartacus stood apart, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the lights of Roman villas twinkled mockingly. Freedom tasted sweeter than he had imagined, but it came with a bitter edge. Rome would not let this rebellion go unanswered. They would come, with legions of soldiers and the full might of their empire, to crush the men who had dared to defy them. Crassus approached, his voice breaking the stillness. "What now, Spartacus? We've escaped, but how long can we survive out here? They'll hunt us like dogs." Spartacus turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "We survive by fighting. Rome doesn't see us as men. They see us as property, something to be owned or discarded. If we want to live, we must show them what we are capable of." Gannicus chuckled dryly, leaning against a tree. "And what are we capable of, exactly? We're a band of runaway slaves with sticks for weapons." "We are more than that," Spartacus said, his voice firm. "We are free men. And that is something Rome fears more than anything." As the fire crackled, Spartacus allowed himself a moment of reflection. His heart was torn between two desires: freedom for his comrades and vengeance against the empire that had stolen their lives. But deep down, he knew that vengeance alone would never satisfy him. Freedom wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about building a life beyond them, something worth fighting for, even dying for. The first revolt had begun as an act of desperation, a spark in the darkness. But now, as Spartacus stood among his brothers in arms on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, he realized it was more than that. It was the birth of a movement, a declaration of war against an empire that believed itself invincible. And Spartacus, the Thracian warrior who had once been a slave, would lead it. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius became more than a refuge, they became the birthplace of an army. What had begun as a desperate flight from captivity transformed into something extraordinary, a rebellion that would shake the Roman Republic to its core. Spartacus, the Thracian who had once fought for survival in the blood-soaked sands of the arena, now found himself the leader of a growing force. These weren't just runaway slaves, they were men and women who had tasted freedom and would do anything to keep it. The training began with little more than the basics. Many of the escaped slaves had never held a weapon, let alone fought in battle. Spartacus and his closest allies, seasoned gladiators like Crassus and Gannicus, took on the task of teaching them. In the shadow of the mountain, they drilled with stolen swords and makeshift spears. Discipline was key, and Spartacus demanded it from everyone, knowing that raw courage alone would not be enough against Rome's legions. The first skirmishes came quickly. Roman patrols sent to capture the fugitives underestimated them, thinking they would be dealing with a disorganized mob. Instead, they faced a coordinated strike force led by a man who had studied their tactics in the arena and turned their own strategies against them. Spartacus used the terrain to his advantage, luring soldiers into narrow passes and ambushes. His army's victory over these small contingents wasn't just a tactical triumph, it was psychological. Each defeated Roman unit sent shockwaves back to the Republic. News of Spartacus's rebellion spread like wildfire. Slaves from across the countryside flocked to his banner, bringing their families and whatever supplies they could carry. Each new arrival added to the strength of the growing army, and with every victory, their morale soared. What had once been a ragtag group was now a force of thousands, and their leader had become a symbol of hope. Rome, meanwhile, was in a state of disbelief. The idea that slaves, mere property in the eyes of the ruling class, could not only escape but defeat Roman soldiers was unthinkable. Panic began to ripple through the Senate. Reports of entire villas being abandoned, fields left untended, and aristocrats fleeing to the safety of the cities painted a grim picture of a countryside in revolt. Spartacus was no longer just a fugitive, he was an existential threat to the Roman way of life. The Senate dispatched praetors to crush the uprising, confident that their legions would swiftly restore order. But Spartacus was not the kind of enemy they were accustomed to facing. He avoided direct confrontation with larger forces, instead using guerrilla tactics to harass and exhaust them. His army struck supply lines, ambushed marching columns, and melted back into the wilderness before reinforcements could arrive. The praetors, humiliated and unable to claim victory, returned to Rome in disgrace. The Roman aristocracy, once so secure in their power, now lived in fear. Stories of Spartacus's victories grew with each telling, turning him into a figure of legend. Some whispered that he was a man chosen by the gods, sent to punish Rome for its arrogance. Others painted him as a demon, a savage barbarian bent on destroying civilization itself. But to the slaves who toiled in the fields and the gladiators still chained in the ludus, he was something far greater, a beacon of freedom. The panic in Rome reached its peak when Spartacus defeated a full consular army. The Republic, which had faced down foreign kings and conquered vast territories, was now being humiliated by a force it had once considered beneath notice. The streets of the city buzzed with rumors. Was this the end of Roman supremacy? could Spartacus march on the capital itself? The Senate, desperate and humiliated, began to realize that this was no ordinary rebellion. It was a revolution. For Spartacus, each victory brought a mix of triumph and burden. His army had grown into the tens of thousands, but with size came new challenges. Feeding and arming his followers became increasingly difficult, and not all shared his vision of freedom. Some craved revenge, while others sought only to escape Rome's reach. Spartacus, ever the strategist, knew that unity was their greatest weapon and their greatest vulnerability. As Rome plotted its next move, Spartacus prepared his own. He had defied the mightiest empire in the known world and lived to tell the tale. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the stakes had never been higher. Each step forward was a gamble, a wager that freedom was worth the cost. And for Spartacus, there was no turning back. The rebellion that had shaken Rome to its core was now at a crossroads. Among the thousands who followed Spartacus, the unity forged in the fires of resistance was beginning to crack. It was Crassus, the proud and fiery Gaul, who first broke away. Tired of evasion and emboldened by their victories, he believed the time had come to strike at the heart of the empire. "Why run from Rome?" Crassus declared to his followers, "when we can make it kneel?" Spartacus warned him of the folly in such boldness. Rome was an empire of endless resources, and Crassus' splintered group lacked the discipline and numbers to survive a direct assault. But the Gaul, ever defiant, refused to listen. With thousands of loyal fighters at his back, Crassus marched north, aiming for glory or vengeance. The news of his defeat came quickly, a cruel blow delivered by Rome's ever-watchful legions. Crassus and his men were slaughtered, their bodies left to rot on the battlefield as a grim message to the rebellion. Spartacus, upon hearing the news, retreated into silence. Crassus had been more than an ally, he was a brother in arms, a symbol of their shared struggle. Now, his death weighed heavily on Spartacus' shoulders, a stark reminder of the rebellion's precarious position. But there was little time to grieve. The pressure from his followers grew unbearable. Some demanded retaliation, others urged retreat. The once united army was fracturing under the strain of uncertainty, and Spartacus knew he had to act decisively. In the quiet hours of the night, he wrestled with the truth. Could freedom ever truly be won in a world where Rome's shadow loomed over every corner? The rebellion had proven that the chains of slavery could be broken, but it had also exposed the terrifying power of the empire they faced. For every victory, Rome answered with overwhelming force, its legions relentless and unyielding. Freedom, Spartacus began to understand, might not be something they could seize in this lifetime. With these thoughts weighing on him, Spartacus made a bold decision: they would march south. Sicily lay beyond the horizon, its fertile lands a potential refuge where the rebellion could regroup and rebuild. If they could cross the strait, they could create a stronghold, a place where Rome's reach might falter. The march south was a grueling journey. The army, swollen with slaves from across the countryside, was as much a moving city as it was a military force. Women and children walked alongside seasoned fighters, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope. Supplies ran low, tempers flared, and cracks within the leadership began to show. Roman generals, now under the command of Crassus, pursued them with relentless determination. Crassus, a man known for his cunning and cruelty, understood that Spartacus' army could not be defeated by brute force alone. He used fear and deception to sow discord among the rebels, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate within the ranks. The betrayal, when it came, was devastating. A group of Spartacus' own men, tempted by promises of clemency, deserted and revealed key strategies to the Romans. The resulting ambush was brutal, leaving many dead and forcing the rebellion into yet another retreat. Amid the chaos, Spartacus fought not just to keep his army alive, but to hold on to the spirit that had brought them this far. Around campfires, he listened to the stories of those who followed him, farmers who had left behind burned fields, mothers who had watched their children sold away, gladiators who still bore the scars of the arena. These stories reminded him that the rebellion was not just about battles and strategy. It was about people. Rome might crush their bodies, but Spartacus believed they could never crush the hope they had ignited. His army was more than a collection of escaped slaves. It was a testament to the human spirit's unyielding desire for freedom. As they neared the southern coast, the dream of Sicily felt tantalizingly close. Yet Spartacus knew that the closer they came to escape, the harder Rome would fight to stop them. Crassus would not rest until the rebellion was extinguished, and within Spartacus' ranks, the seeds of doubt and desperation continued to grow. The rebellion's journey south was not just a march, it was a test. A test of courage, unity, and the will to defy an empire. For Spartacus, it was also a personal reckoning, a struggle to reconcile the cost of their fight with the dream that had sparked it. As they approached the strait, the horizon shimmered with possibilities. But behind them, the shadows of Rome's legions grew darker and longer. The rebellion's greatest challenge was yet to come, and Spartacus, though burdened with loss and doubt, stood ready to face it. The open plain stretched wide under a somber sky, the earth dry and cracked as if the land itself anticipated the blood that would soon soak its surface. Spartacus and his followers stood in grim silence, encircled by the vast, disciplined legions of Marcus Crassus. The trap had been set. The rebellion that had defied the might of Rome for years was now cornered, with no mountains to hide behind, no forests to retreat into. It was here that they would make their final stand. Crassus, ever the tactician, stood atop a hill overlooking the battlefield, his sharp eyes scanning the rebels below. To him, this was not just a battle, it was the final step in crushing an idea that had humiliated Rome. Yet even as he watched, a faint unease crept into his thoughts. There, at the head of the ragtag army, Spartacus stood tall, his presence a defiant flame against the overwhelming tide of Roman steel. Spartacus' army was weary, battered, and outnumbered, but they were not broken. The slaves, farmers, deserters, and gladiators who had followed him for so long now looked to him for strength. He raised his voice, calm and resolute, carrying across the ranks like a steady drumbeat. "We are not fighting for survival today," he said, his sword raised high. "We fight for freedom. For every life they have taken. For every chain they have forged. Today, we show Rome that even in death, we cannot be conquered." The roar that followed was deafening, a cry of defiance that seemed to shake the very air. When the Roman trumpets sounded and the legions began their march, Spartacus and his followers surged forward to meet them. The clash was thunderous. Spears splintered, swords sang, and the cries of the dying filled the plain. Spartacus fought like a man possessed, his blade cutting through the ranks of Roman soldiers with precision and fury. Around him, his men fought with equal desperation, their movements driven by the knowledge that this was the last chance to strike a blow against their oppressors. Courage and chaos intertwined. Men who had once labored in chains now hurled themselves at the most powerful army in the known world, their defiance an unrelenting storm. But Rome's strength was in its discipline, its unyielding formations and endless reinforcements. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Spartacus himself was wounded, a Roman blade slashing deep into his side, but he refused to fall. Blood poured down his armor, but he continued to fight, roaring commands to his men, urging them to hold the line. To his enemies, he seemed more like a force of nature than a man, his defiance a symbol that even the might of Rome could not extinguish. As the battle raged, Crassus watched from a distance, his expression cold and calculating. He knew this was no ordinary enemy. Spartacus had become something larger than life, a man whose sheer presence could rally even the most desperate hearts. But Crassus also knew that even the strongest flame would eventually burn out. When Spartacus fell, his sword still swinging, the battlefield seemed to pause. Roman soldiers hesitated, their eyes fixed on the fallen leader. Even in death, Spartacus had refused to kneel, his unyielding spirit casting a shadow over their victory. Rome made its victory brutal and unforgettable. Along the Via Appia, the survivors of Spartacus' army were crucified, thousands of bodies lining the road like grim markers of the empire's wrath. Travelers passing through could not avoid the haunting sight of men and women, many of whom had fought not for power or glory, but for the simple dream of freedom. Yet, for all their cruelty, Rome could not erase the impact of Spartacus' rebellion. The man himself disappeared in the chaos of the final battle. His body was never found. Some claimed to have seen him fall, others whispered that he escaped, slipping away into the shadows to continue the fight another day. This ambiguity only added to his legend. Spartacus, whether dead or alive, became a symbol, a name spoken in fear by Rome and in reverence by the oppressed. For Rome, the rebellion left a scar on its pride. The empire that had stood unchallenged for centuries was forced to confront the truth. Its power rested on the backs of those it subjugated. Spartacus had proven that even the most tightly bound chains could be broken, and that the oppressed, when united, could shake the foundations of the mightiest empire. For generations to come, the story of Spartacus would inspire. In fields and workshops, slaves whispered his name, sharing tales of the Thracian who defied Rome. Historians and philosophers would debate the rebellion's significance. Was it a doomed struggle against an unbeatable force? Or was it a glimpse of a world where no man or woman lived as another's property? To those who fight for justice, Spartacus remains a beacon. His rebellion, though crushed, showed the power of courage and unity. His name is etched into history, not as a failure, but as a testament to the human spirit's unrelenting desire for freedom. Rome defeated Spartacus, but it could not erase him. His story lives on, a reminder that even the mightiest empire cannot silence the voice of those who refuse to kneel. After the rebellion was crushed, Rome moved swiftly to restore its iron grip. The legions marched through towns and villages, leaving no trace of Spartacus' uprising untouched. Orders were issued, laws tightened, and punishments for insubordination grew harsher. The crucifixions along the Via Appia stood as a grim warning to any who dared to dream of defiance. Rome had reasserted its authority, but the cost of doing so lingered in the air like smoke after a great fire. The rebellion had exposed a vulnerability the Roman elite could not ignore. For all its power, the empire's foundation rested on the backs of the enslaved. Spartacus had proven that the oppressed were not faceless, nameless tools of labor, they were men and women capable of fighting, organizing, and dreaming. Even with the rebellion extinguished, the Senate and patricians remained uneasy. The fear of another revolt seeped into the walls of villas and echoed through the chambers of the Forum. Efforts to placate the slave population grew more subtle. Gladiator games increased in frequency, a calculated distraction meant to remind the people of Rome's dominance while offering fleeting entertainment to the masses. But whispers of Spartacus' defiance endured, passed from household to household, from field to field. His name became more than a memory, it became a legend. In the years that followed, Spartacus' story was retold, evolving into something greater than history. The details faded, embellished by those who told them, until Spartacus became a mythical figure. To some, he was the perfect embodiment of courage, a common man who dared to defy the greatest empire the world had ever known. To others, he was a tragic hero, a man who fought for a cause he could never win. But to the enslaved and the oppressed, he was a symbol of hope. In the dusty fields of Sicily and the grand estates of Gaul, slaves told stories of Spartacus to one another in hushed tones. He was one of us, they said, and he rose against them. His rebellion was proof that the chains of oppression, though heavy, could be broken. He became a reminder that freedom was worth fighting for, even if the cost was everything. Rome may have crushed Spartacus' army, but it could not extinguish his legacy. His story transcended the bloody fields of his defeat, resonating across centuries and borders. From the Haitian Revolution to labor movements in industrial Europe, his name became a rallying cry for those who dared to challenge tyranny. Writers, philosophers, and revolutionaries looked to Spartacus as a beacon of resistance, proof that even in the darkest times, the human spirit is capable of rising. Spartacus' legacy continues to resonate today, a testament to the universal desire for freedom and dignity. His fight was not just against Rome, it was against the very idea that one life could be owned by another. In a world still grappling with inequality, injustice, and oppression, his story feels timeless. The myth of Spartacus reminds us that the struggle for freedom is not bound by time or place. It is an eternal battle, fought in different forms and on different stages, but always driven by the same human need, the right to live with dignity. His story speaks not just of rebellion but of resilience, of standing tall in the face of insurmountable odds. Today, Spartacus is more than a historical figure. He is a symbol, a reminder that even the mightiest oppressors can be challenged. His name is whispered in classrooms, invoked in protests, and etched into the collective consciousness of humanity. Spartacus teaches us that freedom is not given, it is claimed, sometimes at great cost, but always with the hope of a better world. Rome may have restored its order, but the fear Spartacus instilled in the empire remains a testament to his impact. And as long as there are those who dream of breaking their chains, Spartacus will never truly be forgotten. His fight lives on in every heart that refuses to bow.